Welcome to the Building Quality Assessments webinar. Before we begin, it is recommended that participants review the supplementary resource, Writing Quality Assessment Items, presentation from January 19th. The Writing Quality Assessment Items webinar gives specific details on best practices on writing both test questions and answers. Another resource that viewers should look at is the Cohort E TIA application, specifically the Pretest Post-Test tab. This webinar will cover putting together assessment items in order to build a quality assessment overall. The objectives for this presentation are to understand the components of what makes a quality assessment, to understand best practices in creating valid and reliable assessments at the district level, to align district-created assessments to the requirements of TIA, and to understand how to align assessment items to new item types for the STAAR redesign. The agenda for this presentation is as follows. Section 1, Validity and Reliability. Section 2, TIA requirements for district-created assessments. Section 3, questions to answer before getting started with TIA. Section 4, what makes a quality assessment? Section 5, steps in designing a quality assessment. Section 6, STAAR redesign. And Section 7, conclusion. Let's now take a look at our first section, validity and reliability. Validity and reliability are the foundation of a quality assessment system. Let's review these terms and their implications when designing and administering an assessment. During the course of this presentation, much of the discussion is centered on validity and reliability. Validity is the extent to which something measures what it claims to measure, and reliability means the consistency of the results. Let's take a closer look at these two terms and how they relate to the creation of a pre-test post-test system. When discussing validity, we need to ask if the tool we are using accurately measures student growth. What does this look like in practical terms? A district creates an assessment for their 7th grade PE classes. The assessment consists of mostly multiple choice questions about health and anatomy and does not measure performance for certain physical activities that happen in the class. With the majority of the 7th grade PE classes semester spent engaging in physical activity, the assessment of health and anatomy would not be a valid assessment. Let's say the district also created a physical activity component to the assessment that required the student to do 40 jumping jacks, 30 push-ups, and jog 1 mile. That would increase the validity of the assessment since they are covering more of what's covered in the class. Another example of a valid assessment would be the SAT. Psychometricians have concluded that the SAT scores are highly correlated to college success. An invalid example would be a 12th grade reading assessment and a 12th grade English 4 class. While there may be some crossover to the content covered, it would be invalid since the reading assessment does not cover composition and rhetoric. When designing a test, validity is key to building trust in your assessment system, ensuring accurate data is collected, and creating an environment where students are poised to succeed. Reliability is the extent to which the results are consistent. The goal of creating a test is to reliably assess student learning and, in the case of TIA, student growth and teacher effectiveness. There are many factors that contribute to the reliability of an assessment, such as the fidelity of the questions that prompt student responses, the subjectivity of the questions asked, bias, etc. Looking at the example of a reliable assessment, we can see that Juan's TELPAS scale score is showing he has normal or expected growth from year to year. There is no dip in his performance and he's meeting expectations. Based on this, we would assume that the test is reliable. Looking at the non-example, we see that Judy ends up taking the exact test twice and scoring vastly different scores. Perhaps this was a fluke, but it's likely that this test would be considered unreliable since she should score pretty close to what she did before. We will discuss how to increase reliability in your assessment system as we proceed through this presentation. Now, let's take a look at a visual representation of validity and reliability. A test can be valid but not reliable and vice versa. Think of our assessment data as a dartboard. Now, let's imagine a 12th grade English 4 class. Looking at the reliable but not valid dartboard, an example would be the English 4 class taking an assessment that is really geared toward reading instead of rhetoric and composition. Though the scores are similar, or what one would expect, they would not be considered valid since they are not an accurate representation of what was taught in the class. A test can also be valid but not reliable. For instance, the English 4 class takes an assessment, but the scores are all over the place. There are many reasons that a scenario like this could happen, but there is likely an issue with the directions, wording of a problem, or even perhaps the scoring of the assessment. An investigation would need to be completed to determine the root cause of the assessment being valid but not reliable. Our goal is to have both a valid and reliable assessment for the students to take. Using the third image on the dartboard, we can see that valid and reliable assessments meet the mark of quality. All components of a successful system depend on validity and reliability. Now that we have reviewed validity and reliability, let's start by going over TIA's requirements for district-created assessments. District-created pre- and post-tests are a popular choice among districts. The pre-test post-test model is not required to measure growth by TEA. Districts also have a choice of portfolios, SLOs, and value-added measures. Pre-test post-test for TIA can be used for any eligible teaching assignment. This includes both core and elective classes. The assessment must also be reliable and valid. Lastly, the assessment needs to be able to determine student growth. These growth targets can be set locally or by a third party. If the assessment is based on achievement and the district did not have a plan to calculate growth locally, then the assessment would not meet the criteria of TIA. Moreover, student growth measures. This presentation will cover the pre-test, post-test creation. During this presentation, you will hear me refer to option 3 or option 4. In the pre-test, post-test tab of the application, districts will choose which option they want to select. Let's take a moment and read these options. Regardless of the option that districts choose, the student growth measure must have validity to the content and have valid and reliable administration protocols, valid and reliable scoring protocols, security protocols in place, and be used to set expected growth targets. To understand the options in a little more detail, let's examine this graphic. For the purposes of this presentation, we will be looking at options 3 and 4. Option 3 consists of a district-created pre-test with district-set growth targets and a district-created post-test. For instance, with option 3, a district may decide that they want to do everything in-house for their chemistry and physics teachers. They will create their own pre- and post-tests and set growth targets locally. Option 4 consists of a district-created pre-test with a district-set growth targets and a third-party assessment for the post-test. An example of this would be the district creating a pre-test for an 8th grade U.S. history class, setting growth targets at the local level, and then giving the 8th grade social studies STAAR at the end of the year for a post-test. Now let's take a look at the application scoring rubric for option 3. Note that valid and reliable training is required for the administration of each assessment. Security procedures are in place for district-created assessments, and rigorous protocols are in place for writing an assessment, including qualifications to design district-created assessments. Other factors for districts to consider when selecting option 3 of the pre-test post-test are the review and approval process and how the district will set expected growth targets. An example of this are the districts using the half the gap method. Are they using a gain score method? Whichever method is chosen, the district would list that in their application. Another consideration is how the district will determine end-of-year growth and how will a teacher's growth data be calculated. Questions to answer before getting started with TIA. Some questions to answer before getting started. Number 1, what qualifications are required to write standards-aligned district-created tests and which positions are authorized to do so? Number 2, who owns the process? Number 3, what is the process for reviewing and approving district-created tests before they are implemented? Number 4, what security and administration procedures will be used? Let's discuss each of these questions in a little more detail. Choosing the right personnel to create the assessment is likely the most important factor in implementing the pre-test post-test model. While districts do have a choice to use a third-party test, there are many instances where this may not be feasible. It is important the test creator understands the core standards and the basics of item development and vetting items. Teachers, instructional coaches, district content coordinators can be wonderful test writers and utilized by the district. For smaller districts without a content coordinator or instructional coaches, teachers could be utilized to create and vet assessments during the summer months and compensated using a portion of the 10% of the allotment. We also need to answer the questions and sub-questions for who owns the process. Who sets expected growth targets? Is it the district or a third party? Who creates the test? Is it teachers, content coordinators, etc.? Who approves the assessment? Is the assessment going to go through multiple levels of review? How does the district determine individualized student growth? Which method is the district using to determine growth? Half the gap, percentage gains, etc. Who is scoring the assessment? Will it be scored electronically through vendor products like DMAC, or will an appraiser or teacher grade the assessments by hand? Will a rubric be utilized to score the assessment? This is an important step for writing assessments for performance-based classes. These questions need to be answered before getting started. Districts should choose at least one person to help build and maintain their system. Districts also need a process for reviewing and approving tests. A plan needs to be in place to vet all assessments that the district creates. A clear plan for the review process also needs to be in place to ensure the reliability and validity of the exam. Lastly, who approves the final test? These answers will be different for each district, but are important in understanding the components of your pre-test, post-test system. In the graphic, we see an example of multiple levels of review that districts could utilize in implementing district-created pre-tests and post-tests. At the bottom, we see that the test writer is the first level of review. The test writer takes the assessment to the committee who will approve it. This committee could consist of teachers. Once the assessment passes through the committee, it will be approved by an appraiser. And lastly, a best practice is to pilot the assessment, gather data, and make changes before issuing the exam. Not every district will have the capacity to pilot every test. However, when possible, piloting a test is recommended as it can provide valid information and make an assessment even stronger. Note, this is a best practice and not a requirement. In addition, it is important to note that many small districts may not have the personnel for all these levels of review. Small districts could consider working with nearby districts or ESCs to broaden their level of review and increase the validity and reliability of their created assessments. In some cases, it may be the same person doing multiple levels of review. This is acceptable if the process consists of a review followed by feedback, edits, and then another level of review. Additional questions we need to answer revolve around security and administration. What are the protocols and training the district has in place to ensure valid administration of assessments? Is there training at the beginning of the year? Will the district incorporate STAAR security procedures for their district-created assessments? Number 2, how are materials stored? In a locked room? In a Google Drive? Another consideration, what rules has the district created for test administration? Will teachers proctor their own students, or will there be a proctor from another classroom? What makes a quality assessment? Is it the font used, the rigor of the questions, the stretch of the test? It is all of the above, and then some. Let's examine some of the elements that make up a quality assessment. Let's review the elements that make up a quality assessment. 1. Determining learning outcomes to ensure alignment to standards. 2. Various item types. Hopefully they can align to the new STAAR item types. Item arrangement, levels of rigor, length or time of the assessment, clear directions, and styling. Let's start first with determining learning outcomes. We want to use the TEKS as a guide when determining learning outcomes. For instance, an Algebra 2 class may want students to learn how to do quadratic functions. While this is certainly needed, there are multiple TEKS in Algebra 2 that requires the student to use quadratic functions using inequalities, incorporating them into equations, etc. The point is, we would need to do a deep dive into the TEKS to see exactly how we want to test student competency with quadratic equations. When you are determining learning outcomes, be sure they are specific and realistic. For instance, the floral design TEKS 3B states, student classifies and identifies flowers and plants used in floral design. This seems very specific and realistic to learn in a floral design class. An assessment could be created to test this learning outcome of identifying plants used in floral design. How much time should we allocate to testing? The answer is complex and can vary from course to course. Statistically, higher grade levels have more questions on their assessments. Longer tests can increase reliability but also take away from instructional time. Time is an important factor to consider. Will students be able to complete their test in one class period, or would the school decide to implement a practice STAAR shutdown day? Districts would need to decide locally what works best for them. The amount of time a typical student needs to answer some of the following question types: 30 seconds for true-false, 60 seconds for multiple choice, 120 seconds for short answer questions, 10 to 15 minutes per essay question, with 5 to 10 minutes for students to review their work. Taking these numbers, an example could be in a 55-minute class period, you could have 17 questions of multiple choice with one 15-minute essay and allow 10 minutes for students to review their work. Districts would need to decide locally how much time it takes their students to answer questions on a given exam. The more complex the question, the more time it may take to answer. This is an example of the time a middle school social studies test might take. Times and question types would need to be adjusted accordingly for older, more advanced students, such as AP Physics class, or for younger students, such as a third grade science class. One note, for classes of students who are not yet readers and writers, like most early childhood classes, assessment item types and time frames will vary. Districts should consider implementing some of the STAAR redesign item types in their local assessments to increase familiarity with these new item types. Differentiating item types can elicit a higher level of thinking and can show how students applied their knowledge, as well as it supports differentiated instruction and learning models. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the world of assessments, and testing students with varying item types increases the reliability of the data. The benefits of non-multiple choice questions. Number one, they can elicit a higher level of thinking for students. So for instance, having a two-part question where a student has to defend their answer in part B. Number two, they could align with questions asked in the classroom. For instance, students are graphing in the classroom. Using a graph on STAAR aligns well with what students are doing already. Number three, it can show how students applied their knowledge. Sometimes students select a response on a multiple choice test without thinking it through. Oftentimes, these answers do not provide the teacher with a why or how the student answered the question wrong. Being able to see students' work and their thought process through these redesigns allows educators the chance to refine their systems and provide needed interventions. And then number 4, it's more engaging and interactive for students. Students can become bored and complacent when doing a multiple choice only test. These new item types engage the student in a more interactive format, which in turn can combat test fatigue. We are briefly touching on these new item types right now. A more thorough analysis of the STAAR redesign item types will be covered later in the presentation. For the 22-23 school year, Texas is implementing new STAAR item types. Up to 75% of each STAAR EOC for the 22-23 school year will consist of traditional multiple choice items, and at least 25% will consist of new item types. New item types have been created based on input from over 600 teachers statewide. Districts should consider implementing these new item types in their local assessments to increase familiarity. Additionally, aligning with new testing items will increase the reliability and validity of the assessment. Item arrangement should be taken into account. The way we arrange our items can make our assessment more reliable and valid. One best practice is to group items of a similar format together. For instance, grouping multiple choice questions with other multiple choice questions and short answers with other short answer questions. Another practice that should be considered is to arrange the difficulty of questions from least to most difficult, or arranged in ascending difficulty. This helps students to complete some of the less strenuous questions quicker and allows more time for the more difficult questions. For instance, on a history exam, the first part of the assessment may consist of recall type questions, while the latter half may require students to make inferences based on statistical data or to argue a point in an essay. For digital assessments, ensure that students have a place on their computer to work out problems and write notes. If this option is unavailable, students can use scratch paper in lieu of a digital space. Another point to make on item arrangement is to leave enough space for students to work out problems and implement their note-taking and highlighting strategies. If students don't have the room to implement practices learned in the classroom, this could affect the reliability of the assessment. To arrange and evaluate created items, a taxonomy should be used. Bloom's and Webb's depth of knowledge are two examples of this. When creating an assessment, one should aim to have a mix of both higher and lower level difficulty questions. According to researchers, the SAT reserves about 10% of the questions asked to utilize higher order thinking skills such as analyzing, evaluating, or creating. Another best practice is to have a mix of both higher and lower level questions to gauge student mastery across the achievement spectrum, what we call stretch of the test. We will cover the stretch of the test in further detail in the next section. Does styling matter? In short, yes. The styling of an assessment should be non-intimidating to students. The styling should allow room for students to work on problems and implement strategies they learned in the classroom. If possible, designing an assessment to resemble STAAR would be considered a best practice in Texas. Districts creating their own assessments should consider using STAAR styling, which is a size 10 to 11.5 veranda font with at least 1.5 to 2.5 inches of space between questions and provide clear visual aids when applicable. In sum, the more familiar a student is with the assessment styling, the more reliable the test is. Now that we have reviewed what makes a quality assessment, let's get into the steps of designing a valid and reliable local assessment. Progressing through these steps to create local assessments that are more reliable and valid can give you confidence the scores are truly a measure of how well each student understands the test content, and the teacher did indeed teach the content and therefore contributed to the child's assessed growth. Step 1. Identify the learning outcome or objective of the test and how it is aligned to core standards. Step 2. Determine the formats of items to be used. Best practice is to use various item types and align the new item types for STAAR redesign when possible. Step 3. Construct an initial pool of items. Step 4. Review items and revise when necessary. Step 5. Combine vetted items into a group of items that will be on the test itself. Step 6. Consider levels of difficulty or stretch of the test. Step 7. Implement best practices around item arrangement, such as test length, style, directions, etc. Step 8, pilot the assessment and revise when necessary. Note, this is a best practice and is not always feasible for every assessment. Step 9, administer and score the assessment. Now that we've gone through these steps, let's begin with the more thorough examining of step 1. Identifying the test purpose and objectives is paramount in designing a quality assessment. The objectives set the foundation for the other pillars to rest on. Before item creation, test creators need to identify the objectives they want to assess. In the state of Texas, TEKS allow creators to quickly identify the objectives. From the selected objectives, all item types will be developed around them. For instance, a 7th grade Texas history class, one of the TEKS states in 7.21c, organize and interpret information from outlines, reports, databases, and visuals, including graphs, charts, timelines, and maps. The assessment creator would need to include questions that have students interpret information from maps, graphs, and charts. Once one has a list of objectives, they would need to decide if the objectives measure the skills students have learned. So for instance, does the pre-algebra exam have Algebra 1 skills which have been taught to students on it? Would this be an accurate measure? Probably not, since the students have not learned this information. Let's take a look at this example. Miss Lawrence is an Algebra 2 teacher working with the math department on designing a pre-test. Miss Lawrence knows that all items on the test will stem from their agreed upon standards aligned objectives. Her department decides on the following objectives: graphing linear, quadratic, and exponential functions, solve linear and quadratic equations with a variety of methods algebraically and with the graphing calculator, and solve and apply systems of equations to inequalities. Now that the objectives for the assessment are specified, Ms. Lawrence can move on to the next part of building a quality assessment, which is determining the item format. Now that Ms. Lawrence has her objectives, she needs to decide how she's going to assess them. She decides that for the purposes of her assessment, students will be best suited to graph linear equations on graph paper. She decides that she will use multiple choice to assess if students can solve and apply systems of equations to inequalities, and she also wants them to show their work and has a word problem at the end for students to show the steps they took to complete their work. Now that Ms. Lawrence has determined item format, she can move on to constructing an initial pool of test items. Now that Ms. Lawrence has determined her item format, she is going to construct her initial pool of items. She wants her assessment to be in line with the new questions on STAAR redesign and notices that 25% of the items on the new STAAR will consist of redesigned item types. She begins to write her initial pool of items based on the objectives and uses the table of specifications to ascertain their level of difficulty. The table of specifications can be very basic, simply listing the skills to assess in one column, the number of questions to test this skill in the second column, the level of difficulty you intend to use for each question in the third and fourth columns, and then the number of total points for each skill in the fifth column. By determining the number of questions to cover each skill and the point value assigned to each skill, you are deciding on the relative importance of each skill. This can also assist with validity by making sure you are adequately covering the tested content. Then, by determining the level of difficulty of each skill, you will be deciding on the type of question format appropriate to test each skill. The stretch of the test is its ability to measure growth across a wide variety of ability levels. For instance, Ms. Lawrence gives her Algebra 2 test to students, but the questions are too easy for most of the students and the grades come back overinflated, and she was unable to see if students were in the lower, mid, or upper tier of mastering the content. The next year, she includes a few harder questions to be able to see precisely where the gaps are for her higher achieving students. Does the test give reliable data for both the highest and lowest achievers? The best practice is to have a mix of both higher and lower level questions to gauge student mastery across the achievement spectrum. Consider making a table of specifications to determine the types of items you should write or use from an item bank, which we will talk about shortly. After meeting as a group, the math department from Elm Tree Elementary decided on the following items to represent one high-level and one low-level difficulty question. The low-level difficulty question is a STAAR redesign item type. The high-level question is a multiple choice question. Note that the higher level question requires students to add improper fractions, whereas the lower level question just has students add the fractions. Let's take a look at another example. Note that the higher level question requires the student to make an evaluation. This skill is higher on Bloom's taxonomy than analyzing, which the second question asks us to do. Let's take a look at this question from Intro to Welding. Note that the higher level question requires the student to make an evaluation and use math skills to determine the tolerance. The lower level skill requires the students to identify a weld. Identifying would be considered as knowledge, or one of the lowest levels in Bloom's taxonomy. Next, it's time to review items. It's best practice to do this through a committee, and then once it has passed the committee, it could be approved by an administrator. Be sure to complete this step even if you're using an item bank to ensure the validity and reliability of the questions. During the review and revision process, it's a good idea to come up with a rating system for items and determine what the margin of error is for calibration on each item. The review process allows others to check for validity and come to an agreement that the questions are aligned to the content taught. Measurement error is reduced by coming to an agreement on the correct answer. Consider creating a table for rating the quality of each question. Best practice would be for each rater to be within one domain of each other before giving the test. Another best practice is to exclude any item types you are not in agreement on. Now, let's take a look at an example of a rating table. Looking at this rating table, we can see that the 3 items were rated excellent. One was rated average, while another one was rated weak. There is a section for comments in the far right column. In this case, the teacher felt that the students were going to confuse a word on the first question, and the second question should be rephrased for clarity. The rater would compare their rating to that of their colleagues and determine which questions need to be changed or excluded. It is always a best practice to review and revise items in which raters were uncalibrated. Let's take a look at a question that needs to be revised from a 7th grade Texas history assessment. Notice that the unrevised item tests knowledge of state agriculture, physical features, flags, and economic activity. The revised item narrows it down to economic activity. This informs the teacher where the student is weak in their knowledge of Texas economics, thereby making the assessment data more reliable. With the unrevised item, the teacher would be unaware of which of the 4 areas the student is weak and may not be as successful with their future targeted interventions. Now that items have been reviewed and revised, we can now combine the items to form the test. Be sure to include best practices discussed earlier, such as STAAR styling, leaving room for students to implement strategies, and clear visuals. Now it's time to pilot the assessment if possible. This is a best practice that may not be practical in all districts for all assessments. After reviewing items with colleagues, if possible, give the assessment to a group of students who are similar to the students who will be taking the assessment. Some options are piloting the questions and assessments you give throughout the school year, over the summer, or with the group of students who matriculated from the currently tested course, like students in a 7th grade theater arts class piloting an assessment for a 6th grade theater arts class. It is important that we look for clarity that the questions are giving the responses needed. Are students consistently answering a question wrong even though they have learned the material? If so, this would affect the reliability of the assessment. Perhaps the question needs to be rephrased and/or omitted. The last step is to revise as necessary. No test is completely perfect, but they can become both fair and reliable through revision. During the piloting session, you may notice that some questions are not eliciting the correct response from students. There could be a few reasons for this. Words with double meanings. Like the example of the word bark. Does it mean bark on a tree or the bark of a dog? Using words with double meanings could make the test unreliable. Additionally, item or stem could be unclear, including the visual aids. Was the text too small? Was the visual aid used unclear? Clarity is key to having a valid and reliable assessment system. Another issue is the item may not be aligned to a taught skill, where students expected to multiply and divide fractions while only being taught how to add and subtract fractions. If this is the case, then the assessment would not align to the skills taught, and the assessment would need to be revised because the data would be invalid. And lastly, an item may have bias or cover a sensitive issue, which could also affect the reliability of the assessment. Let's take a look at a question that needed to be revised after piloting the assessment. The item needed to be revised because the teacher found out that the students did not have context for golf fairways. Almost every student who piloted this question missed it. Revisions need to be made. In sum, the item was not accessible and fair for students of diverse backgrounds. One group has an unfair advantage over another group of students. When we look at the revised item, students are familiar with the track from their PE class, and this data would be more reliable. These are the kinds of things that are often found during the piloting process. The last step is to administer and score the assessment. Consider implementing STAAR security protocols like proctored exams, limited access to the assessment before it's given, and locked in storage if applicable. Implementing such protocols will increase the validity and reliability of the assessment. Next, the assessment will need to be scored. Many districts have capacity to have these assessments scored by machine, but they can be scored by hand as well. Don't forget to incorporate a rubric for your essay and short answer questions. Continue to revise your assessment to increase reliability. After giving the assessment, you will notice some trends to be addressed. Be proactive in making the necessary adjustments before giving the assessment again. Now that you have a reliable assessment, you can reuse or modify the items by recycling them in successive years. To assist those who are building quality assessments, let's take a look at some of the new STAAR redesign item types and consider how they could be incorporated into your assessment design strategy. For the 22-23 school year, Texas is implementing new STAAR item types. Up to 75% of each STAAR EOC for the 22-23 school year will consist of traditional multiple choice items, and at least 25% will consist of new item types. New item types have been created based on input from over 600 teachers statewide. Districts should consider implementing these new item types in their local assessments to increase familiarity with them. Additionally, aligning with the new testing items will increase the reliability and validity of the assessments. Let's take a look at some tables that break down the STAAR redesign item types. The equation editor allows students to write their responses in the form of fractions, expressions, equations, or inequalities. Text entry will allow students to respond by typing a brief string of text such as a number, word, or phrase, and then graphing will allow students to independently create different types of graphs. Additional STAAR redesign item types include Students can now use a number line to select points and demonstrate a solution. Inline Choice will allow students to select correct answers from one or more drop-down menus, and Hotspot has the student respond to a graphic by selecting one or more specific areas. Hot Text will allow students to cite evidence by highlighting within a passage. Additional new item types include the Match Table Grid, which has students match statements or objects to different categories presented in a table or grid. Multi-Select will allow more than one correct answer for an assessment item. There's also Short Constructed Response, which has students give a brief explanation of their understanding in their own words. And Extended Constructive Response will allow students to write an in-depth response to a provided stimulus. The last STAAR redesign item types we need to address are the fraction model, which uses visual representation and divides an object into a number of sections which indicate the numerator and denominator. Drag and drop has students move stimuli to a given area on a map, graph, chart, or diagram. Multi-part consists of students answering two-part questions. And the fraction model allows students to shade in areas of a divided model to demonstrate their understanding of fractions. Let's take a closer look at a few of the item types and how they can be incorporated into a local assessment. For graphing, the student selects points, draws lines, drags bar graphs, and performs other functions to independently create different types of graphs. This is going to be used in Math 3rd through 8 and then all EOC math courses. This is a replicable item on a pretest post-test. So for instance, districts can create graphing by providing a section to the test where students are physically required to graph select points. Another item type is Inline Choice. The student selects the correct answers from one or more drop-down menus. This is going to be used in Math 3rd through EOC, RLA 3rd through EOC, and Social Studies 8th through EOC. To replicate Inline Choice, districts could convert these questions into fill-in-the-blank type questions where students select answers from a word bank. For the hotspot item type, the student responds by selecting one or more specific areas of a graphic. While this item is an example from 8th grade social studies, hotspot is also used in 3rd grade through EOC math and RLA. To replicate hotspot item type on a paper assessment, students could circle or highlight the correct areas on a provided stimulus. The drag and drop item type requires that the student evaluates a given number of options, words, numbers, symbols, etc., and chooses which options to drag to a given area on a diagram, map, chart, etc. This is going to be used in Math, 3rd grade through EOC, Science for 5th, 8th, and EOC, and Social Studies 8th and EOC. This item type can be easily replicated on paper by creating boxes and having students fill them in or by drawing arrows to the correct box. The benefits of non-multiple choice questions. Number one, they can elicit a higher level of thinking from students. For instance, having a two-part question where a student has to defend their answer in part B. Number two, they can also align with questions asked in the classroom. For instance, students are graphing in the classroom. Using a graph on STAAR aligns well to what students are already doing. Number three, provide information on misconceptions. Sometimes students select a response on a multiple choice test without thinking it through. Oftentimes, these answers do not provide the teacher with the why and how the student answered the question wrong. Being able to see a student's work and their thought process through these redesigns allows educators the chance to refine their systems and provide needed interventions. And lastly, number four, it is more engaging and interactive for the students. Students can become bored and complacent when doing a multiple choice only test. These new item types engage the student in a more interactive format, which in turn can combat test fatigue. Some item banks are set to implement new STAAR redesign item types. Eduphoria, DMAC, Texas Formative Assessment Resource, or TFAR, and the TEKS resource system. If you don't have access to these item banks, many of the STAAR redesign items can be replicated using district-created questions. As we discussed during prior slides, most, if not all, item types can be recreated using traditional paper tests. Scoring these item types should be a consideration, as not all of them will be able to be scored in the same way that traditional multiple choice tests are. To conclude, let's review the 7 steps in designing a quality local assessment. The elements that make up a quality assessment are determining the learning outcomes and ensuring alignment to the standards. Using various item types, hopefully some that could align to the new STAAR item types. Item arrangement, levels of rigor, the length and time of the assessment, clear directions, and lastly, styling. These are all important factors in building a quality assessment. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, please reach out to the TIA inbox at tia@tea.texas.gov. Thank you. For additional resources on building a quality assessment, please visit these links.